the ESUP Open Science Cluster webinar series, and we're excited to have you here. Hope you all had a great week at ESUP last week. If you were there, I wish I had been able to attend, but I heard a lot of amazing things about the sessions that went on. So excited to kind of hear more from that. As you all know, in the Open Science Cluster, we are doing a webinar series, and kind of we have some thematic areas that we're focused on. And this first is trust in science and open science. And so we've had amazing speakers come in, and just so you know, as Jenny just mentioned, we're recording all of these. And if you go to the ESUP Open Science Wiki, the recordings are made available there. So, you know, definitely go back and watch those that you've missed. We're very excited to have a special guest today, Irene Pasquetto. I hope I said your name right. Okay, great. Irene is going to be talking about what is research data misuse and how can it be prevented or mitigated. And just to give you a little background, Irene is a scholar in the field of information and communication science. She conducts research and teaches as an assistant professor at University of Maryland College of Information Studies. Her most recent research focuses on issues of science mis and disinformation, open science practices, and public understanding and use or misuse of science products and infrastructures. From 2018 to 2020, she was a postdoc fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Irene earned her PhD in information studies from UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, and that is my alma mater. So Jenny, we have some common things here. Where she also worked as a research assistant at the UCLA Center for Knowledge Infrastructures and the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. And previously, Irene earned a master's and a bachelor's degree from the University of Verona in Italy. And so we're super excited to have you here, Irene. I'll turn it over to you, and then after you present, we'll open up for some Q&A. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad I have this opportunity to present in front of you all. Also because selfishly, I hope to collect some feedback on this work in progress that I'm working on with my collaborators, Andrea Tomer, Morgan Watford, and PhD student Zoe Kellen. So today we'll investigate with you the questions of what does it mean to misuse research data, and if we agree that this might be a problem, how it can be prevented or mitigated. So as I know the participants to this webinar are kind of very aware of, there are many good reasons to incentivize the sharing and reuse of research data, including to reproduce research, make public assets available to the public, leverage investments in research, and to advance collaboration and innovation in science in general. And we also know that often the reuse of open data leads to the production of new urgently needed knowledge. And also we know that researchers and research agencies are increasingly expected and in some cases mandated to release research data and make this openly accessible. However, fears of data misuse can impede the open sharing and reuse of research products. Anxieties about misuse of data predates the COVID-19 public health crisis, but the events of the last few years made such concerns more visible and urgent. A point in case has been a decision, which some of you might remember, by the CDC not to publish critical data on hospitalized COVID-19 patients' vaccination status, fearing misinterpretation by the public and the media. The CDC's fear did not originate in a vacuum. Other science stakeholders, like the curators, for the digital curators of preprint digital archives, also hurried to design new curatorial interventions aimed at avoiding misinterpretations of COVID-19 preprints and the related data. For example, they added some additional filtering mechanisms to the publication process and new labels and metadata to the preprint download pages. These curatorial interventions aimed at preventing misuse varied across digital archives, and we have really little knowledge of whether they worked or how they were intended to work. So during the COVID-19 health crisis, science stakeholders found themselves lacking both a theoretical framework to understand when, how, and why misuse of research data could occur, as well as a plan to prevent, limit, or respond to potential cases of research data misuse. So what we hope to do with this research, which is again a work in process, is to help develop a shared framework for defining and preventing data misuse that can be adopted by data intermediaries to take important decisions about when and how to release crucial research data. But there is a problem here, and it is a problem of epistemology. Defining data misuse is important, but it's also not an easy thing to do. It is very difficult and challenging, as it turned out. First of all, to misuse a research object can mean many different things, as we will see. And while misuse is often unintentional, right? Let's face it, it can also be intentional. It can be done to deceive or manipulate others. Misuse can be rooted in a variety of causes, and not all data sets are at the same risk of being misused. Finally, concepts of what constitutes misuse, and this is probably the most important point, must be epistemologically situated. One community's misuse might be another's best practice. Indeed, there have been many numerous examples of studies once considered fringe science, right, that were eventually drawn into the mainstream science. So any definition of misuse must be mindful of these cases and make sure to be inclusive of marginalized perspectives and communities. So in order to work towards a better understanding of the complexities of data misuse, we examined how researchers in a number of fields and scholars in a number of fields currently understand and define the practice of misusing research data. So we reviewed literature that discusses conceptualizations of proper data use, as well as improper or misuse of data. And also we reviewed cases and examples of what data misuse looks like in practice. So we looked at the research areas of open science and data sharing practices, which is mostly in information science, critical data studies and data feminism studies, fairness in algorithms and ethical data science, information data literacy, and also in the history of science. And across all these fields, we look at how instances and definitions of misuse varied by data producers, data donors, expertise and identity of data reusers, reasons to reuse, concerns identified with reuse practices, and proposed solutions. And then we showed how these different domains kind of describe and define data misuse and identify areas of overlap and disagreement. And now we are proposing a definition of data misuse and a proposed set of mitigation and prevention strategies. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to present the 6 different kinds or types of data misuse that we identified. I will briefly talk about the common themes that we see emerging in the literature, and then I will present the draft definition and draft strategy for prevention and mitigation. Okay, so the first kind of data misuse that I want to talk about is also kind of the most straightforward one. It consists in data reusers making analytical mistakes, literally errors in the secondary analysis of available data. We did find concrete examples of this kind of misuse. But these examples that we found that were actually documented were often about journalists or politicians or data science amateurs making mistakes, not really other scientists. So for example, in the data feminism book, Dignazzo and Klein talk about the misuse of data from the GDELT project, which is a digital archive that collects worldwide data about media content. So in this case, journalists working for a famous data-driven news site reported that certain events in Africa were happening at a much faster rate than they were actually happening because they miscounted instances of such events in the data. So Dignazzo and Klein attribute this problem not only to the kind of inattention of the journalists, but also to the lack of contextual information that the GD ELT archive provided about the data. So there was a problem of kind of like lack of detailed curation or description of this data and documentation. So the second kind that we identified is about misinterpreting the data. So it is different from the first typology, from the first type, because the kind of mistake or error in this case is not in the analysis of the data, but in its interpretation. So let me give you an example from our literature review. In 2019, NASA released some data about wildfires in Australia. An artist reused this open data to create a map of these wildfires, which became viral, and it was shared by many people online and also by celebrities, with the good intention, obviously, of raising awareness about the scale and the gravity of these wildfires. In these viral posts, the celebrities implied that the map was representing live event of wildfires, again, with good intention. But it turned out that the map was visualizing data for a month of wildfires, right? Not live data. So what happened is that some other users use this misunderstanding, right, as an evidence that the wildfire emergency was overblown and on social media, and to argue that the wildfire were happening at a normal rate in Australia. So while misinterpretation of data is unintentional, it can be intentionally weaponized. So the author of the academic paper that talks about this case study proposed as a solution that not only the data should be properly documented, right, when they are shared, but as in the previous case, but that there should also be a principle in place that enforces data stewardship and curation for the data reusers and requires data reusers to properly curate and contextualize secondary analysis of available open data. So in this case, NASA could have requested that in order to reuse available data reusers like the artists had to document their data visualizations with contextual information to make sure that the meaning of the visualization was clear. So also, as I'm sure this audience is well aware of, the FAIR principles for data management and documentation represent right now the gold standard for documenting and sharing research data. Their application has proven effective not only in maximizing the reuse of open data, right, but also in preventing analytical mistakes and misinterpretations of open data like the ones that we just reviewed. However, these principles have been also recently criticized to some extent for the lack of specificity about what constitutes ethical reuse, as they can't really prevent other kinds of data misuse that can lead to great emotional and physical harm, as we will see in a second. So for example, a kind of data misuse that cannot really be prevented by the sole application of the FAIR principles is what we refer to as reputation-related data misuse. And this stood out to us because it was mentioned across all the literatures that we looked at. So this is something that people seem to really care about. And it includes 3 sub-kinds of misuse. So first, instances in which data reusers do not give credit to data creators, either by not giving them some expected co-authorship or by not citing the data set that they reused, right? But the opposite is also true. Data reusers adding kind of automatically data creators as their co-authors without data creators even knowing what the secondary analyses are about. What we found curious is that while these first 2 sub-kinds were kind of like always talked about in the literature, they were also always talked about in hypothetical terms. So it was really hard to find some concrete examples of this kind of misuse actually happening. The third reputation-related sub-kind of misuse consists in the public shaming of researchers after failed replication experiments. So, other researchers reusing data, trying to replicate an experiment, but failing to do so, and then shaming others, the people originally created the data. And this is probably the most feared data misuse. This way of misusing data is becoming extremely common, especially in the social sciences, as there are plenty of scientists conducting these replication experiments of available data, failing to do so, and then again going on Twitter to shame those who conducted the original experiments. And we think that this trend suggests the need for sort of like etiquette for communicating the results of replication experiments, right? So it's a good thing that people are replicating, but at the same time, this can still be done in a respectful way. Another kind of misuse that requires special care well beyond the application of the FAIR principles, especially in biomedicine and ecology, is the violation of privacy and its consequences. The re-identification of biomedical data is, of course, a big one. But we have to say that we didn't find many examples of harm done by the re-identification of human data, like recent examples. There were some, of course, from the past. There are some now, but not that many. And this is probably because this is probably the most kind of like well-regulated, understood the problem, right? Privacy for humans. Some would even argue that it's too regulated. On the contrary, we found that geoprivacy violations for animals and plants seem to be little understood and even less regulated. So we found a bunch of documented cases of data misuse related to the geoprivacy of animals and plants, cases of course, poachers are accessing location data, wild animals to illegally hunt the animals. We also found a case in which a government, the Australian government, released the research data on shark attacks, and then these data have been reused, but what we can define shark fanatics to find and kill those sharks. So another kind of data misuse that is increasingly talked about is misuse as a form of exploitation. This is where we see the limits not only of the FAIR principles, but also of traditional approaches to ethical data reuse, in particular, the use of informed consent. So for example, historian of science Joanna Radin analyzed the problematic reuse of genetic data from indigenous communities. The case involves the collection of blood samples from an indigenous communities in the American Southwest for a diabetes study in the 60s. So the data were collected in the 60s. Then in the 80s, this data was added to a repository for training machine learning algorithms without obtaining a new informed consent from the tribe and their relatives. The data was then used many times to train machine learning algorithms for all sorts of things, and most of these were for commercial purposes. So Radin, the historian of science, argues that this case raises concerns about ownership, control, appropriate compensation, and benefit sharing associated with the reuse of data obtained from indigenous and other marginalized communities. So in order to address the specific concerns related to reusing indigenous data, Carroll et al. Proposed to integrate the FAIR principles with the CARE principles, which broadly argue that I'm kind of summarizing here. The use of indigenous data should result in tangible benefits for indigenous collectives. The reuse should be consistent with community values, and that indigenous people's ethics should inform the use of this data across time. Of course, it remains open the question of how can these CARE principles be applied to the needs of other fragile and marginalized communities. Okay, so finally, the last kind of data misuse that we identified consists in the uncritical use of bias or offensive data. So the issue here is not that there is an error in the analysis. It's not that the data has been misinterpreted. This is not a problem of privacy, of exploitation, but there is an issue with the data itself, which is either biased or offensive. So there are plenty of examples of this kind of data misuse, and probably it's probably the best documented, I would say, and talked about case of data misuse. Some famous examples are gender biases in employment data sets that are used by recruiters, or racial biases in risk assessment data used by police enforcement agencies, and also the presence of offensive language and images in data sets used to train image recognition algorithms, as like in this paper that I have here, Excavating AI, that tells the story of one of these data sets that contains really offensive language and images. So in these cases, misuse is really any uncritical use of these data sets, right? Now, the thing is that best practices for reusing biased data sets exist, so this is the good news. So for example, Leonelli et al. In a paper titled Methodological Data Fairness basically explain data reusers how to be reflexive, reconsider all the assumptions that go into the design of a study that uses biased data, make this explicit, and think about ways to integrate or repair these biased data sets. For example, qualitative data or other strategies. So the authors really talk about how to do this in practice with real data, and describe how the authors themselves reused biased data from Twitter for a health-related study, and how they compensated for these biases, for the biases in the data, and reduce the potential of harm. Okay, so overall, in all the papers that we read and we analyzed, scholars definitely agree that in order to properly reuse and make sense of open data, data reusers need to have detailed information about the nature of the data and how to use it, right? So information about what data represents, data formats, what tools are needed in order to use this data, its quality, its granularity, etc. And there is also an agreement that curatorial approaches like the FAIR principles efficiently provide the reusers with such information. But there is also this kind of recognition that this traditional approach to data curation that is focused on maximizing reuse is not sufficient to prevent all forms of misuse and the related harm. So overall, what it emerges is that in order to prevent harm when using open data, and we are taking this observation from obviously multiple papers, data reusers need to, first of all, adopt these self-reflexive research practices that make the design assumptions and biases embedded at each stage of the research process explicit, situate their secondary analysis in relation to the broader social and political context, the idea that the numbers do not speak for themselves, and also be mindful and respectful of others' data work, when attributing credit and replicating existing analysis. So based on all our observations and what is emerging in the literature, we developed this draft definition of misuse. And we propose to think about data misuse as any kind of data use that does not take responsibility for the potential harm caused by such use, by not doing the things that we mentioned earlier, right? By not adopting these self-reflexive research practices, by not situating secondary analysis in their broader social and political context, and by not being mindful and respectful of others' data work. We choose the word responsibility in the definition because it's a word central to feminist theory and theories of care that values care and collaboration and shared benefits over individual benefit and individualism. It seems to us that this definition is broad enough that it can highlight what is at stake here, which is that misuse can result in real harm, but at the same time, it's not too prescriptive in the sense that it does not try to elevate one kind of, one way of knowing the world as better than another. So for data reusers, right, to be able to take responsibility for preventing harm that can emerge from misusing data, science stakeholders and data intermediaries then need to put these data reusers in the condition to be able to do such a thing, right? So that's the idea behind the prevention and mitigation strategies, especially the prevention strategies. So these strategies are aimed at empowering users with information that can help them prevent harm caused by data misuse. Now, we divided these strategies in two categories. The prevention strategies are aimed at trying to prevent, right, unintentional misuse. While the mitigation strategies are intended to mitigate intentional misuse. So now it's really hard to kind of define and especially identify and prove intentional misuse, but it exists, right? I think about it as a kind of, as a practice, as a kind of data misuse that does not bear reason, right? We can talk more about it later, but so when misuse is unintentional, right? We propose these prevention strategies. So first of all, as I also want to say that this should be used in addition to the FAIR principles, right? So data should be curated following the FAIR principle. But in addition to that, the first one would be to enforce data stewardship and curation for users, as we talked about in one of our examples earlier. So the idea here is that if you reuse open data, you should be required to share the results of your analysis and the new data you are producing, right, with your analysis, following certain standards, at very least the same standards that were used to curate the data that you used. So sort of like CC BY of digital curation, if that makes sense. So the second prevention strategy would be to enforce also these self-reflexivity in reuse methods. So for example, this methodological approach for using biased data that I talked about that exists can be made clear in the user guides of open data, right? Because again, it's very practical. It might sound a little abstract, but it really shows you how to use biased data in a way to prevent harm. So the third would be to work with communities to decide what values and research questions should drive data reuse whenever it's possible, though not always a community is available to have this type of conversations. Also be explicit about how to attribute credit for data work and make sure to credit also invisible data workers, because that's something else that emerged in the literature, that often those who clean the data, for example, or curate the data are not given credit for their work. And finally, adopt some guidelines for sharing results of failed replication experiments, right? So you share open data, you say, we do our best to do our job the best that we can, but we might make some mistakes. If you find some mistakes in our data, please, communicate these mistakes following these guidelines, something like that. This will protect the researchers, right? So intentional misuse, again, is a type of data misuse that does not want to hear reason, right? So it is, again, really hard to identify and prove. You can't really prevent it. So that's the idea here. You can't really prevent it, but you can still mitigate it. So the first thing would be to assess the potential risk, the potential and the risk for misuse based on, looking at the past, if it's possible, and similar cases of data misuse. But the most important strategy here would be to have a plan in place for pre-banking and debunking the disinformation that might come out of this intentional misuse with concrete examples of proper and improper use. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with how pre-banking and debunking works. I can talk more about in the Q&A if you're interested. But basically, there are some communication strategies that data intermediaries can use to mitigate these situations after they happen and also before they happen. And finally, it is important to keep in mind that when done properly, digital curation of open data sets some quality standards in the case of controversy, right? Meaning that if the data end up being misused, the data intermediaries and the science stakeholders that decide to release this data can use their user guides as a reference for showing what the data actually represented and what research questions were, appropriate for this data and what were not appropriate. And that kind of concludes my presentation. So we are now in the phase of, brainstorming the discussion of this paper. So it would be great to hear your feedback. And also, ideally, we would want to work with some researchers to try to implement these strategies.
Thanks ever so much, Irene. And it was a really interesting presentation. I have a few questions, but first I wanted to open it up for others to ask questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type into the chat and I can repeat the questions. Okay. Well, let me start with a couple of questions. So really interesting, kind of how you had identified the types of data misuse, and in terms of kind of the protocols and the plans to mitigate. I was wondering if you've considered kind of how to enforce these types of practices. You talked about kind of the unintentional misuse and the intentional misuse, but I was wondering in addition to that.
Right. So I think enforce is it's a strong word, right? Yeah. It cannot be probably fully done in order to enforce, but at very least, these strategies can be part of the documentation that is shared along with the data, right? Yeah. And I think, so the idea here would be that at very least when misuse is not intentional, right? These strategies can be effective, also based on, all the kind of examples that we found. But again, when it is, intentional, if there is somebody who wants to reuse data to create some, misleading type of information, it's done on purpose, that's, again, something that you can't really enforce anything there. And that's where you have to work with mitigation strategies.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I was particularly thinking with respect to, for example, the misuse, whether intentional or unintentional, of data in journalism, and obviously that one's a trickier one, I think. And then my other question was if you could talk a little bit about the pre-bunking and debunking. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. Pre-bunking and debunking disinformation plans.
Right. So these are strategies that are used when you deal with either a potential for a disinformation campaign or in response to a disinformation campaign. So if you have some data set that you want to share and it might be a risk of misuse, like climate data, right? We know that it's a risk of misuse. The idea would be, but again, it can be intentional, it can be not intentional, but the idea would be to share some examples of how this data could be misused. This would be the pre-banking. So the idea of pre-banking is similar to like vaccination, meaning that to inoculate your your audience, or in this case, the people are going to reuse the data and see these data sets with with a little bit of what this information might look like. So then if they encounter it, they can recognize it. So in this case would be to share some examples of what a misuse of that data set might look like along with the data set. So, you share the data set, its documentation, and then some, like a simple example of what a new research question, a new study using that data could look like, and what a misuse of that data, so something that, it's, it will look as a disinformation based on that data might look like. So it's kind of like, that's the idea behind the pre-banking. And then the debanking is more about once the data have been misused already, there is a plan in place to respond, right? So like fact checkers, when there is a disinformation campaign going viral, they know they have a sort of communication strategies to mitigate that disinformation campaign and kind of explain why it was an improper, in this case would be an improper use of data. So that would be the debanking, which is something that is not, improvised, but it's something that usually people who do this work on before. So you have a plan for debanking as well. Possible kind of disinformation campaigns that are being using your data, if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you plan to provide that kind of information in your research in terms of these examples of pre-bunking and debunking, etc.?
Yes, what I would like to do next, also with my collaborator, is to work with some either research center or group of scientists that are handling some data that might be a risk of misuse, right? Either, vaccination data or climate change data or these sort of things, or geoprivacy also data. And trying to see how these strategies can be implemented in practice. If that makes sense. So yeah, I feel like, because talking about it in abstract, I feel like, we should see how these looks
yes
like.
Now you want to put it into practice and test
right.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much. There are a few comments in the chat. Pen Huang noted, thanks so much for this much needed overview of not only possible misuses, but also mitigation. Completely agree with that, Pen Huang. And then Brian noted, more of a comment than a question, but one of the reasons or excuses by some researchers for not sharing their data is this fear of misuse. Other than well-documented and curated data, these other responses are generally out of the original researcher's control. And yeah, I think that kind of goes back to my comment about, for example, the use in journalism, etc. So perhaps that is why they would rather try to assert control by restricting access and wanting to be able to determine who can use their data.
Yeah, that makes sense. Exactly.
Yeah. And then Jonathan asked, is it fair to say that with the broad definition and examples shared for data misuse, that data that is not misused is appropriately used, or should we consider other categories of data misuse or use?
Interesting scenario. Right. Yeah, no, I see the question, and in a sense, so to be honest, so what was interesting is that in these papers, these were not all papers, actually just a few of the papers that we looked at where like the whole paper was about misusing research data, right? Just a few of them, maybe 3 or 4. Most of the papers were about how to properly use research data. And then in the papers, they had examples of misuse. So they would mention misuse of data here and there, but the paper were about how to properly use data. So in a sense, we looked at both how they thought about what misuse is, and also kind of how they conceptualize what good use of research data is. So I think it's a mix of both. It could be in a sense, I think, but since the focus was not how to properly use data, but more about trying to understand how data can be misused, there might be more to it about, what's the use of research data. So before working on data misuse, I was actually working on data reuse, more in general. And then so I did some work on that and looked at how researchers reuse existing open data, and there were many, many different ways of doing that, right? So yeah, that's another kind of work I feel like.
Yeah, thanks. I also there's a comment from Brian, which this is a really interesting point. So Brian notes, it seems to me that data misuse can be addressed by the research community in similar ways to addressing the misuse of other scholarly communication or articles.
Like articles, yes. Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of exactly, that's kind of the also what I'm trying to work on, and I agree on that. So to move some of these practices from like scholarly communication into the communication of these data sets. And I have to say, because one of my expertise is data management and data and how to share and make data available. So digital curation. I tend to think about mitigation strategies from that angle, right? And also prevention strategies. So it's, if the misuse is unintentional, it can be prevented by, describing certain ways of like working with this data. So yes, I agree with that, basically.
Yeah. And it almost seems that you have to have kind of an iterative process or plan, because maybe you haven't thought of potential misuses of the data that come up, and so it seems you would have to kind of be proactive, but also somewhat reactive.
Yeah, exactly. And this thing, as I mentioned in the introduction, not all data sets, right, are the same risk of being misused. At this point, we kind of like, know what are the, or it's, you can to some extent understand and trying to, like, you know, predict if your
Yes.
data is at risk of misuse. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, Brian brings up a point in terms of maybe opportunities for adding to data in terms of the metadata and the documentation as a way to incorporate this additional information to address some of these gaps. And yeah, I was thinking about that, Brian.
Right. Yes. So that's, yes, exactly. That's basically what I hope to do. Yeah, that's exactly what I think the point of this research is, that, you know, the FAIR principles are great. And again, I've been working on, you know, how to maximize the use of open data myself, and how to describe, you know, the data in a way that all researchers can reuse it also across fields and all of that. But at the same time, because I was working with some biomedical data and there was an issue of misuse there, that's when all of this started. I kind of realized that just maximizing the reuse of data is not enough. There was another kind of like layer that we needed to add to the curation, which was about kind of like trying to prevent this type of misinterpretation of the data sets. So yeah, so I think it is a curatorial approach, right? So instead of restricting the release of the data, you kind of try to like curate in a way that at least when misuse is intentional, which to be honest, in most of the cases is unintentional. It is unintentional. It can be kind of, again, limited, I would say, if not fully prevented.
Yeah. And Pen Juan asked, is there a way to receive the bibliography or list of references that you mentioned today?
Sure, yes, we can. So we have all of the references in a Zotero group library, which we can make public and share. I can share it with you.
Okay.
We wanted to link it in the paper when we submit it, but we can also share it with this group.
Okay, thanks ever so much. And would you also be okay if we share your email address?
Sure, of course.
Okay. Let me see. There is a lot of chatter in the chat. Andrew notes that it seems like verifiable data lineage would go a long way to identify and address misuse of derivative works.
Yeah, in an ideal world, right? That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Problem, yeah, of course, it's very hard to track reuse of data sets unless, you know, data citation really started to be, implemented. But that, that would be great.
Thanks, Irene. Any other questions, comments, and please do feel free to come off mute. Okay, well, again, thanks ever so much. This was really interesting. I have a lot of notes myself, and I will send a follow-up email to the Open Science list with Raina's email address, and then once you provide me the link, Raina, I will I'll just wait for that, and then I can send a follow-up email.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is
Cindy, I noticed you came off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, so really appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks all. We will see you next month. I think it's the 22nd of August.